Thanks to be here. I start to say that I will not speak directly about my work, indirectly of course, yes, as it is like to repeat me. If any of you are interested in deepening my compositional path, you can find on my website the audio-video editing of 2 lectures in English and French held respectively at Harvard University and the Conservatoire Supérieur de Musique in Paris, which speak specifically of that. Here, what I am proposing you is a reflection on the theme as it has progressively materialized in the month that preceded this lecture. A composer's reflection, perhaps a different kind of piece, without any pretense of musicology or philosophy. For some years, I have been working around what an instrument is, of course, both compositionally and poetically. Poetically in the sense of a thought generated by a musical practice, developed through free associations and brought back to musical practice, to be used for each compositional choice. The question is apparently simple and generic. What is an instrument? Formulated in this way comes from a work not yet completed for electric guitar solo, which for some years has been the main reference of my research. In the previous pieces for solo instruments, the question was more specific. What is a violin, a clarinet, a soprano sax, a recorder, a string quartet, a viola, a double bass, precisely? Music has always made me think on the sense of relationships without a specific verbal meaning, and the works for solo instrument in particular, on the nature of the medium used to collect and transmit that sense. Over the years, I realized that the respective answers contained in each of those pieces, obviously personal and provisional, shared some elements, both timbral, articulatory, and formal. Similarities given by my growing tendency to explore instruments as if they were ancient cities, each of them with its own historic center, consisting of everything we scholastically associate to that instrument, and a progressively less defined periphery made up of what is more uncertain, less homogeneous, hidden. But living cities, or, in other words, characters, each of them with its own characteristics, and a vast area of additional specificities, more difficult to define publicly. More private, I would say, but for me even more interesting because, as in daily life, it is from these hidden specificities that a passion, a friendship, or a love can eventually arise. A trend, this feeling of instrument as living cities, that piece by piece has extended both in time and space the perception of the instrument that too often we consider only a tool of the craft, to be used according to our needs. And if in the first pieces, as often happens, it was an instrumental peculiarity that attracted me most, for example, the superposition of real and harmonic sound associated with the speed of hand articulation on the violin fingerboard, or the tremors of false positions and the pure diets on the clarinet. With the sax-soprano cycle, the ductility of his voice, associated with the complexity of its multiphonic world, suggested me the possibility of a different kind of song, perhaps easier in those years, 1996-1999, but the relative novelty of the soprano sax in the contemporary classical context. And gradually, in the following pieces, the exploration work around the initial particularity extended to include areas of reference that went far beyond the instrument itself, that allowed me to discover them. For example, speed and lightness through the tenor recorder in Edo no Ana, the existence of a sound inside a sound and therefore the possible acoustic three-dimensionality of the harmonic relationship between complex sounds with the saxophone quartet, avvicinamento. And even further away, with the string quarter cycle, il ciclo dell'assedio, the siege cycle, with friction as a threshold, passage, bridge towards the acoustic world outside the concert hall. And further away, up to the horizon without a body, from which the viola starts again in the ciclo del ritorno, the cycle of return, to slowly come back to the whole concert, trying not to forget and transform what she encountered in the long journey from the horizon to her body rebirth. And a new beginning, with a different attempt, remaining close to the center, the scolded traditional sound, dig into the most archaic strata of the double bass, looking for a possible continuity between its heavy matter and the infinite series of harmonics that thins and enlightens that matter, until the birth of consciousness, perhaps, in the two rides of Ur for double bass solo. Returning to the metaphor of the city, it is clear that, as far as the solo instrument is concerned, the lesser-known part of it has always attracted me in a detail, a characteristics, something that only it can do in that way, which in the metaphor of the instrument as a character becomes the interest in its criticalities, intended as passages towards a deeper dimension, maybe, beyond the consolidated role of the character, towards the being that animates it. For this reason, what attracts me more and more is how that detail, that characteristic, that criticality relates to the entire history of the instrument, or rather, as heard and thought from that detail, the whole history of the instrument assumes a different perspective, which in dialogue with the previous ones helps to extend its boundaries and therefore its sense. But let us come briefly back to the work still in progress, which, trespassing the specific instrument, has generated a broader theme that includes all the instruments. The electric guitar and its world, almost completely external to the acoustic experience from which I come, immediately posed a number of additional problems compared to those that the practice of traditional instruments had taught me to deal with. Because its electrical component is not just a component, but a series of tools which in turn transform the starting impulse according to very different degrees, especially if they are using a chain as the electric guitarists normally do. I am referring to the so-called more traditional effects, such as wah-wah, flanger, phaser, chorus, overdrive, distortion, whose internal components vary considerably depending on the brands already in the single effect. And we could open endless discussions on the qualities or this or that effect, their associations in a chain, the creativity of some brands compared to others. Not to mention that so far we are talking about specific objects, little boxes, therefore limited in their possibilities, but if we start to consider their digital simulations, which have recently reached a surprising quality level, the limits of the analog chains quickly disappear and give life to a totally fluid acoustic world in which it becomes, so to say, physically impossible to hold in your hands something concrete. Yet you can tell me, in rock music there are thousands of pieces with electric guitar, although very few for solo electric guitar. And in recent years, in the, so to say, contemporary classical field, its use has become very widespread. So something has been tied. It's obvious. Of course, I've listened to a lot of them, extracting the fragments that interest me more and collect them into different families, choose for sound quality and articulation, all them in relation to each other, with the result, on the one hand, to gain a detailed overview that was previously inconceivable to me. On the other, to lose myself little by little in this great sea that I have myself generated in the search for further sense. What I would recommend to anyone wishing to write a piece for solo electric guitar would be choose 2-3 analog effects, explore them, get some interesting materials and build starting from their characteristics. Almost all the successful pieces for this instrument are made like this. I didn't do it, because what really attracts me to the world of the electric guitar is not what I can develop around a specific quality of sound or articulation, although many among them are very interesting. What attracts me most is the possible origin of that Protean diversity that does not have precedence in the history of musical instruments. If not with one, in part, the organ. But we'll talk about this very interesting analogy in another occasion maybe. A chorus of simultaneously acting elements that have proliferated and developed almost exclusively starting from improvisation, most of the time in the total absence of writing. Here another element not to be underestimated. Wanting to understand that choral elements, which writing process we have to adopt in composing for this instrument that has substantially done without writing for decades? The same as for any other classical instruments? Admitting that every composer has his favorite path in writing a piece, this path can be summarized in a writing process. As you can see, this instrument that for many reasons we could consider the most immediate, almost always connected to the direct expression of emotion, has generated in me a need for distancing, listening, and reflect, far superior to the previous ones, even forcing me little by little to rethinking the whole nature of sound and consequently of my previous idea of making music. An encounter clash that is both frightening and enlightening. That's why I associate it with Leviathan. But beyond the risk and the practical problems that this entails to premieres in the Norwegian cancelled, I am still convinced that if you want to look for a whale, you cannot stay in your harbor, your comfort zone. You have to take off and go to the open ocean. Returning to the topic, let's move it slightly now. Is it possible to find a way that leads us from individual specific cases, the instruments, to what could have generated all that variety? That is to say, is it possible to rethink multiplicity, infinitely precious precisely because of the diversity it safeguards, starting from a system of relationships that we could define as common origin, the instrument, singular? I believe that the search for deeper relationships, a search that often starts from the gift of intuiting them for an instant, a gift that made Picasso say, "I don't seek, I find," is strictly related to the possibility of finding something more close to the origin, not original. This interests me much less, and often not at all, close to the origin, that is, closer to the specific need which generated that specific solution. A string instrument, for example, or a double reed that substitutes your lips to put in motion the air column in a tube. In my last case, looking for the origin of the electrical effects I mentioned, looking for them in the acoustic nature of the vibrating strings, I found myself exploring their memory, from the ancient Cycladic harps to nowadays, on empty strings, finger, plucked, rubbed, listening to a classical guitar like an ancestor, an archaic source of acoustic waves. Something far away, perhaps more inward, to what is usually associated with a guitar, while remaining a guitar. I apologize for this long introduction, but I think it was necessary to begin to contextualize the apparent banality of the initial question at a different level. More, I wanted to quickly show how important questions, thoughts, images radically change depending on who interprets and experiences them. That is, they radically change depending on how each of us gets there. For example, here, taking as reference the Leviathan, the title of this surprising work of immediate impact by Anish Kapoor that both intrigues and disgusts in me, or Melville's Moby Dick, to which I certainly feel more akin, completely excluding its more dated symbolic accompaniment, or John Bonham's long drum solo in Led Zeppelin's Moby Dick, again, which takes place on the edge of a very precise fury, apparently impossible combination. There are just 3 examples that, together with a brief description of the previous compositional process, show us how the results of a radical rethinking of the subject, in this case the Leviathan, can lead to completely different interpretations, not only related to the expressive language used, visual, literary, musical, but also within the same medium, in our musical case with John Bonham's solo, for example. The more the subject is essential, in some way connected to the quality of our being alive, the more its interpretations will be complex and different, as if it were alive in its turn. It is therefore necessary that each of us ask him/herself the important questions, and try to answer, in his own language. We increasingly need the contribution of all languages, not just the European ones. And I am certainly not referring only to the language of our nation, although the language used already contains a lot of phonetic and phonological characteristics. Language understood as a product of all our components of place, culture, personal history that have contributed to forming us as individuals and have merged into our main expressive medium, in this case music. Google offers about 100 translations of our questions, and about 50 of these even with pronunciation.
ما هي الآلة الموسيقية؟
वाद्ययंत्रों की तापाले
És un instrument
एक संगीत वाद्य
musical.
यंत्र क्या है? ما هي الآلة الموسيقية؟
Vad är
എന്താണ് ഒരു
Ang
സംഗീതോപകരണം?
instrumento sa musika. 什么是乐器？ एक संगीत वाद्य यंत्र क्या है?
Voices without face, memory, generically women, men, generically young, generically voice. But if in everyday life we are able to recognize a familiar voice without seeing its face even decades later, it means that in that vibratory flow are contained acoustic relations so strong as to be distinguishable even in almost total autonomy from the meaning. If by changing the words, age, emotional state of the speaker, we continue to recognize their voice, it means that each voice potentially preserves and transmits something unique. What we lose in that synthetic pronunciation, in that being generically voice, is precisely the value of uniqueness. And in every uniqueness, as Peter Handke said, there is a form of perfection. We are now used to these kind of simulations that are progressively overwhelming us in the name of useful. And in part certainly they are, but we must be careful what we give up by using them and how much these simulations affect the possible sense that we believe we express through them. It should make us think that we are usually identified as users. Users of something already done by others, with a freedom of choice planned by others in the software, for example. It seems that I am digressing. I do not think so. I am reintegrating a series of references to our theme that make it totally current. If we replace the word voice with instrument, a set of instruments with their MIDI simulations, an electric guitar with its sampled version, an experiential process of composition with an algorithm pre-paged by others, it's perhaps clearer what we are still talking about. Also because for me, musical choices and daily experience are always connected, and if you want to be more independent in one, we need to become independent also in the other. Therefore, summarizing what we have encountered so far, we'll have a new clear perspective on our team, divided into 3 provisional concentric areas. First, an instrument is a tool with specific characteristics, of course, and although it is clear to everyone that you cannot skew with a hammer or strike an A with the cut of a screwdriver, it is not so clear what the actual boundaries of a musical instrument are. Its periphery and more private zones, we said. We'll see how the 900 has enormously extended them. 2. The instrument as actor endowed with extraordinary longevity who, adapting to different places, time and contexts, interprets them, transforming itself according to the needs without losing its specific characteristics. I am overall interested now in its more or less gradual transformations, which will serve as a reference for even new ones. 3. The instrument is a specific place of the entire acoustic space. Its physical and cultural characteristics filter everything that passes through it, returning as a selection of what happened and, in some cases, a perspective on previously lost memories. In fact, we have just mentioned this aspect, but we'll develop it later. I was saying 3 concentric areas. One does not exclude the other, it contains it. The order in which they occur is personal. It depends from where we start in our research. In this case, I continue in the indicated order: tool, character, specific place of the acoustic space. The musician uses the instrument and, at the same time, is used by the instrument in a path of mutual discovery. Every great instrumentalist or composer adds something to the history of the instrument, or rather, to the sense of the instrument through which she became what she is as a player or composer. The 900, I was saying, and in particular the second half, has considerably expanded the boundaries of the instrument and the individual by exploring its less obviously characteristics. How? Extending the conventional registers, in the high of the instrument itself, in the use of unconventional variants of the instrument mainly towards the low, bass flute, double bass flute, contrabass, clarinet. In the invention of new instruments, sax, accordion, drums, set in jazz or rock, electric guitar, bass, synth, extending the usual techniques, we move from the orchestration treatise in one volume, however substantial, to a series of volumes dedicated to individual instruments, adding compositional elements previously little or not used at all, the supporting role of percussion, the formation of new small instrumentally highly characterized ensembles, the growing importance given to the performer and his/her instrument in dedicated programs, the extension of durations, particularly in solo pieces or very special duo or trio, the systematic introduction of preparations, summed objects, self-built instruments, and opening, together with all this, the new electroacoustic way, with the microphony through microphones that collects the hardly perceptible, and the macrophony, spacephony, that spreads it to reach the audience, up to the complete exclusion of instruments with the electronic music and a partial return with the live electronics associated too. Sorry for the inevitable approximation and lackness of this brief description of the recent event, still in progress. For something more accurate, we should stop several hours on each step. But I wanted to share with you a first overview, which, although I have shown here in sequence, is to be understood as a fluid whole, simultaneously and differently present, today available for everyone to listen to through recordings and peer-to-peer on the network, also in a great distance, a geographic and temporal distance. Both the already written, often in multiple interpretations, and equally important, a good part of our improvisational research, on which the development of all instrumental techniques has essentially always been based. Techniques that writing, in the best cases, has systematized, developed and composed, leading them to experience a broader breadth, preserved in form, to which we, as composer, players or listeners, can continually come back, as if it was an always active source of discoveries. Here too, an open ocean in which we have to learn to navigate. And we are in the second area, the instrument as an actor with extraordinary longevity who, adapting to different places, times and context, interprets them, transforming itself as needed without losing its specific characteristics. Here, by instrument, I no longer mean, for example, only the flute that we find in the orchestra, even with all the extended techniques, but the instrumental variety that can be traced back to that mode to put in vibration the air column inside a tube. From the first bone whistles, going up to include the Rajasthan Nard, the Turkish Nade, Indian Bansuri, the Japanese shakuhachi, the Renaissance and then Baroque recorder, to return to today's transverse flute, in my opinion there is no evolution nor progress, but a change of function. Each of them, and all the other flutes that I do not mention here, corresponds to the needs of the time, not necessarily past, and of the place that these instruments have relied on to get to say what the voice couldn't say. The voice. We'll be back soon about the voice. Starting from the assumption that every traditional instrument is complete in itself as a stable result of a process of progressive refinement, which often also corresponded to the highest technological level available, I think that we can instead trace a sort of gradation in the complexity of the role that the instrument interprets. From the sound object with a single function to the large organ of the Milano Cathedral with 15,000 pipes and 200 registers, it is clear the quantity and quality of the roles that the organ can interpret is obviously incomparable. This, I repeat, does not mean that the organ is better than the bone whistle. The user of bone whistles would not know what to do with an organ, just as the organist of the Duomo would not know what to do with a whistle, and even less with a bone whistle. Think about what Xenakis or Ligeti could have done with a couple of whistles or three, because we all know what they did with the organ. They are not random names, it's clear. What is perhaps less clear is that certain composers more than others, each in the context of their personal affinity with something and not with something else, come to integrate in their work aspects of making music that are less temporally limited and local, opening up in this way new roads towards the past, towards the future, or rather, towards elsewhere in the present. Which other composers after them will travel more easily but not with the same results. We will return later on this theme. Obviously, we do not have time now to enter the strictly organological aspects, which would be interesting at this point to try to rethink, starting from what I had defined as the instrumental periphery, what is more unstable and uncertain, rather than from the physical form and its building materials. In this regard, however, the reading of Andreas Schaffner's text Origin of Musical Instrument of 1936 is still very stimulating, demonstrating how a radical approach nourishes and informs the system, whatever it is, so in depth that it is hard to overcome it by a simple addiction of datas. Eventually, it will be replaced by another radical approach, a paradigm shift. And we find something similar talking about composition too. I mean, adding a new effect to the list of those usually used does not change anything. A new perspective on the instrument could change a lot, everything, even our life. So, I therefore propose to momentarily compress all the instrumental variety into a single infinitely complex place, not a kind of instrument, but an instrument, compared to which even the organ of Milano seems like a simple sound object, the phonatory apparatus. We will use it as a reference to try to find similarities and differences with all the mechanical instruments. But let immediately leave behind us all the rhetoric of singing, or, still worse, of the bel canto, which, as it has often been said, is characterized by the inimitable variety of its sound qualities. If we take an opera singer, for example, I would certainly not speak of an inimitable variety. And the same goes for the leader singer for Renaissance, medieval, Gregorian vocal music or folk, blues, jazz, rock, or the traditional Arab, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, Inuit singer. Each of one, if individually considered, is a very specific cultural selection of what is possible to do with the phonatory apparatus associated with the breath. Excluding the word sing and replacing it with voice, implying voice instrument, without any specific sexual, personal and cultural connotations, then yes, we return to having an infinite variety of sounds and articulations, and the possible continuity among them, produced by a single, maximally elastic instrument. The voice instrument, including the animal phonatory apparatus, is unquestionably the most widespread on Earth. At the present time, considering only living humans, there are about 7.85 billion of different voice instruments scattered around the world. A presence so widespread that it is not usually noticed. It reminds me the so-called dark matter, which, although consisting about 90% of the matter energy of the universe, no one yet knows what it really is. A presence with which it seems particularly important to deal with if we want to understand something deeper in our research. I mentioned its elasticity. I think that what distinguishes the voice from instruments is not, as is often believed, neither the minor extension nor the inability to play several sounds at the same time, but rather the extreme malleability of its physical components when compared to the mechanical nature of the musical instrument. Let me go more in detail. In the vocal apparatus, everything is elastic, starting from the bellows of the lungs, passing through the vocal cords and arriving in the oral cavity, where both the tongue and the posterior palate and its access to the nasal cavity are totally elastic, while refinedly mobile is the distance between the two dental arches, beyond which, as a threshold to the outsides, the lips become very elastic again. The almost infinite combination of states among these components, as well as the absence of interruption in the passage between these different states, definitely places the voice in the continuum field. And the world around us is continuous. On the other hand, this section of the instrument and all their separable components, holes, keys, pistons, strings, frets, are evident interpreters of the discontinuous. And the information, as a selection of what happens around us, is discontinuous, discrete. There would be a lot to say about the relations between continuous and discontinuous. Also from a compositional point of view, of course. Now there is no time, just let our lived experiences resonate. The most interesting aspect for us, as composers, is that the totality of the voices and the totality of the instruments, from the initial belonging respectively to the continuous and discontinuous, have increasingly moved toward their complementary, limiting the elasticity of the first and making more malleable the rigidity of the second. We have already partially seen the expansion of the instrumental boundaries. Let's take a closer look at what happened to the voice instrument. The first diversification in its use occurs with verbal languages and the relative linguistic families, which acoustically translated means the same elastic instrument, limiting its elasticity, has progressively specialized in producing some types of very complex sounds and articulations, but not others, depending on the phonetic system and the phonatory characteristics of its geographical area. Sounds and articulations that can be very different from area to area, such as English and Chinese, for example. Among these, actually, the case of tonal languages is particularly interesting for us. In Chinese, for example, for each vowel, there are 5 possible tones: high, ascending, descending, short descending, neutral, which allow us to assign different meanings to homophonic words. As if the trend of the sentence, therefore its internal references of pitches, dynamics, durations, and timbre, were the signifier to which we entrust the actual sense of the message. Le signifié et le signifiant basse sourd, I mean. Particularly interesting for us because music could be the further extension of that signifier, which becomes totally autonomous in expressing its specific sense precisely when one leaves behind any verbal meaning, and for this reason sometimes beyond any possible speech so emotionally engaging. The other diversification internal to every linguistic family, and therefore not subsequent but contemporary to the progressive aggregation of languages around specific characteristics, is the wide selection of elements that distinguish a spoken voice from a singing one. The ordinary from the extraordinary, hazarding a third pole between two, perhaps a bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary, the poetry. A different selection according to the space-time cultural areas and in continuous transformation even today. Sorry, I go fast. Even here, I'm interested in arriving at a vision, perhaps too personal, but a global vision. The selection process that has been underway for a few centuries in the European area, from speech to sing, takes place basically slowing down the verbal flow and dissecting the continuum into precise distances, both between heights, pitches, and between durations. The definition of precise intervals that must refer to absolute pitches is of instrumental derivation, and much later than the approximate difference between pitches initially due to the randomness of the objects found, then to a rudimentary construction technique, then to the exclusively local use of the instruments produced. With a very slow transformation of these data, will then come the comparison between the different results and the progressive integration of them in a broader field. Mainly using the voyal or semi-voyal components, introducing vibrato, also to overcome the difficulties of intonation, reducing the range to exclude the extremes, both of register and intensity, and therefore dividing the voice into voices, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus the additional specifications, bass, baritone, tenor, alto, mezzo-soprano, soprano, and the conventional registers and roles. It's interesting to observe how, by reversing this process, we immediately find ourselves in the operational area of a good part of the contemporary vocal music. Widespread use of consonants, no vibrato at all, maximal interest to exaggerate register and dynamics until shouting or whispering, and a parallel path of singing together, from heterophony to antiphonal, with passion overlaps between who ends and who begins, so the tenor pedal and a parallel movement between two diagonal opposite movements until the mix of polyphony to arrive at the accorded one. But it's important to remember that although this selection is conventional hegemonic in the context of so-called cultural music, it's in turn only a part of the selection made by other traditions. Different selections to which we should definitely pay attention if we want to become more aware of the voice instrument itself. Particularly interesting is the case of the various types of vocal and non-vocal resonators, fixed or mobile, present all over the world, which amplify, transform, associate a starting vibration with something else, often a hum, a buzz. We could say that they are in some ways the mechanics that is lacking in the elasticity of the phonatory apparatus. A scalar filter that stabilizes areas of the vocal flow so that they become more evident sections of the voice instrument. On the other hand, as regards the instruments, the material with which they are made affects above all the type of possible making, therefore on their building characteristics and the resulting timbral articulatory qualities. In any case, a certain stability of the material is required, or an easy replacement of the unstable element to ensure lasting results, for instance, the reed, the strings. Limiting myself now to those of the Western cultural tradition, I summarize and add to the synthesis I made a little while ago some of the elements that have contributed to smoothing their rigidity, bringing them closer to the voice. Extension in the use of instrumental families, integration of other new instruments, extension of specific articulatory techniques, expansion of the percussion spark, not necessarily of a rhythm nature, integration of non-tempered environment in string and wind instruments, integration of complex sound in the monodic instrument, voice inside the instrument included, the systematic introduction of preparations, sound objects, self-built instruments, extension of the concept of sound, and extension of the concept of form, from previous model to new processes. In particular, I was saying, from the second half of the 20th century in favor of a progressive integration of the enormous acoustic area that until the middle of the last century was still considered noise, disturbance, or to broaden the discourse to the parallel expansion of the social perception of the individual, abnormality, deviance, pathology, madness. Realizing that those anomalies contained precious differences to deal with. But it remains as a characteristic of the instrument with respect to the voice, the possible speed, the precision of articulation and reproducibility, only possible thanks to the mechanical component, even if its more vocal additions, microtone, complex sounds, tremolo, fall position, remain more delicate than the traditional use. In this conversion, I said, of the voice towards the instrument and the instrument toward the voice, of the continuous toward the discontinuous and vice versa, with all the supports used as connections and bridges between the ordinary daily speeches, acoustic environment, and the extraordinary, a supposed further dimension that lives beyond the everyday affairs, music can focuses our attention to something peripheral from the usual focus, something that diagonally and internally connects it to a previously unpredictable other. A connection that sometimes generates a third element, not a sum, but a fusion of both. And suddenly we have a new born from a convergence of previously unrelated causes. So it is not even a question of overcoming something, the already known, the ordinary, the relatively moderate, the natural, but rather of perceiving its intrinsic otherness, the further dimension, the hidden memory, the possible etymology that updates past experiences by indicating the present and future ones. And it is not something that you have to make an effort to do. It's an attitude of listening. The possible depth of a work, therefore, is not in the presence or absence of a preparation, a series of multiphonics, megaphones, resonators, sound objects, or new instruments, theatrical actions, and even less in a new unpredictable algorithm, but from the quality of the relationships that the music develops among the chosen elements, possibly including also those I've just mentioned. Whatever is the starting selection, it always has to focus on something, translating and integrating everything it has discarded into that something. Something that, through the writing, our classical tradition develops and preserves in a form that we could define as a bearer of sense, a sense theoretically independent of the player, but practically entrusted to his or her ability to interpret it. Arrived at the interpretation junction, let's enter now in the third, even more incomplete and enigmatic area. The instrument as a filter, a focal lens, which collects and concentrates the power of listening. Here, voices and instruments are complex sections of the entire acoustic space. Each one of them is a perspective, a specific formula that allows us to slow down, momentarily stop, and understand a part of the flow in which we are immersed. From the beginner player who looks for his or her instrument in every music to hear only that one, to the accomplished player who understands music through his or her instrument. And we could say the same talking about composition. From the young composer to the adult one, the interests move, or better should move, from what I can do to distinguish myself to what is the question that music is asking me and that I still don't know how to answer. What is that unknown? Strong enough to prevent me from doing anything else than trying to find the next local solution to answer it. I mean, in the new piece. From the beginner player to the accomplished one, I was saying, each instrument constitutes a specific synthesis of our acoustical cosmos. Also in this case, a cosmos as complex as you move away from the usual conventions in both directions, further away and more inside. But talking about acoustical cosmos, we are also talking about a special kind of space, a living one. And from space to place to context to piece to an instrument, we are compressing more and more what is constantly nourishing them in a local, shareable way of being. A precious one. So, coming back to the instrument, we find a resonator at the origin of all the instrumental researches, both as an amplifier of acoustic phenomena, otherwise too weak to listen to, and as a selector, highlighting some acoustic characteristics extrapolated from the acoustic continuum. The resonator can be external from the origin of vibration, as the empty body of strings instrument, for instance, or internal, as for wind instrument, But both cases, and for the voice too, the instrument itself lives in a wider resonant space, the one in which it plays. Our room, the stage, the concert hall. So we already have at least two resonant spaces, acting each other on the same time. But there is also a third resonant space, our memory, constantly inhabited by memories of other instruments, other players, other music, other concert halls, which more or less consciously we interact with what we are listening to now. I mean, in our memory everything is living now. The only time of memory is the present tense. And the spatial quality of a space-time context selectively affects our perception, bringing to the evidence certain aspects rather than others. In the case of voice, for instance, it's often a spatial acoustic space that makes us singing. The bathroom is a case that everyone knows. Why the bathroom? Because usually it's a more empty space than the other rooms of our home, therefore more resonant, but also usually a smaller place than the other rooms, in which one we usually feel more free for many reasons. Perhaps also because it is a place where we usually undress, not just of our clothes, but even of our main social roles. And going a bit further, a special space-time context selectively affects our perception, as a special relationship with a person triggers a specific attitude, friendship, admiration, confidence, love, which make us more and more attentive and confident. Coming back to the instrument again, I think now we can really begin to feel it as a living body, a physically defined space capable of condensing the broader space with which it's included. A specific life space in the apparent emptiness. But when life is present, emptiness disappears. In fact, I said the apparent emptiness, because it's more a potential state than a real void. A potential state that aggregates and becomes instrument with a specific body, as every one of us, opening a different perspective on the whole humanity, in our case, or on the acoustical space, in the case of a musical instrument. Now, it could be interesting to go further inside the specific perspective of each instrument on the entire acoustical space. I mean, a flute perspective, a clarinet perspective, a French horn perspective, a violin, viola, cello, double bass perspective. But unfortunately, we have no time for that now. But despite this suspension, I think this is an interesting arrival point. What the instrument is suggesting us. What and how is it filtering for us about the acoustical space? We think to know the instrument that we are using in a piece, as we think to know ourselves in the act of composing. Of course, we know something of both, but that something is really enough for us. I mean, is really enough what we already know? There is a deep difference between the trademark of distinguishability, the so-called personal style, relatively easy to achieve in some years of work, and a recognizable perspective, that each time discover a new portion of its field. You can copy a trademark, but you can't copy a perspective. I mean, you can dig into a perspective and discover something else living inside. In this field, each discovery is inimitable, as all living being. Each of us as a composer, but not only, as a human being, has his or her own specific filter, made by infinite sub-filters. Each of us is a specific filter, and this is the true importance of every life and every instrument. We must never take life for granted. It always needs care. I think that the origin of music has something to do with our being bodies, each one a specific one, or rather, in the capacity that a body has as portion to contain, resonate of something specific. To be alive is to be resonant. This is the gift of birth. Our duty, perhaps, is to discover resonant of what and how. A process that lasts a lifetime. So we too are instruments, belonging to the second and third areas as characters and filters. Not tools at all, of course, even though many people still treat others as if they were objects. And the act of composing is also an instrument. Each consistent piece is an instrument. And even music itself is an instrument, a really powerful one, in a practical, vibrational way, to get better and better some of the possible senses of being part of something wider. So, where we are now? Here, in the upper left corner, where you can see strumento, a corner from which I try to develop a perspective that would let emerge the overall image, the vision, of which it is a part. I had this image just before leaving home 13 days ago, and it seems to me that it may be useful to better contextualize all the lectures so far. Sorry for the Italian words. We can spend many hours trying to develop the perspective from each corner. Of course we can now, but it's already a good result for me if we even only taste the potential of a crossed perspective on the same focus. We can see it in the middle, inside, that big A for ascolto, that means listening. The magic attitude able to activate everything. Thanks for the attention. As a special gift from Salim Sawaid, he will play for us now the second part, affrettandosi verso il centro della luce risonante, hastening towards the center of the resonant light, from my saxoprano solo cycle, Necessità di interrogare il cielo, need to interrogate the sky. Perhaps, I hope, some of the enigmatic sentences we encountered during this lecture will become a bit clearer thanks to the living music. Actually, we write music to say, to discover what words fail to achieve, even the most poetical ones. And I propose you to listen to him without score, leaving all the technical aspects out and just listen. You can have a look at the score afterwards on YouTube if you want, or asking me for it.
Thank you.